Check, check, 1, 2.
All right, thanks, bye.
Check.
I'm filling in?
Yes.
Right here?
Yes. Just happened right now. Mr. McEachin is in a meeting.
Okay.
And he's just coming in. And we'll begin in a few minutes. Our panelist,
Oops.
her Uber got a ticket, so she just walked into the building.
Uber got a ticket?
Yeah.
It's never happened to me before.
And she was just coming from Howard. So these are our panelists and their introductions and titles.
Okay, is there an introduction? What am I saying to begin with? Oh, thank you. Of course.
Just so you know, Mr. McEachin will do some opening remarks,
Mhm.
then he'll pass it on to Deb,
Okay,
and then Mr. McEachin will then introduce both of you. You're both the speakers.
okay. Do we have, who's going first?
You will start with Elsa.
Okay. Okay.
Elsa?
Hi, I'm Janita.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I can have them on my phone.
So just a reminder, Mr. McEachin will do some opening remarks at
Colin, how are you?
See
Nice to see you. I was
here.
here, thank you, I was here with the Antiquities Act,
Mhm.
and you came and you gave some remarks
Thank you.
during that time. And I worked
Thank
with
you.
two of the people and Amy Allison, and as part of lifting you up. So it's so
Okay,
wonderful
well,
to be here again.
Give Amy my love.
I will.
I watch her every day on Twitter, so.
Yeah, she's doing great
Yeah,
things, so
wonderful.
thank you.
Nice to
Hi,
see you.
nice to
Thank
meet
you
you.
for being
No,
here.
thank you for having me.
Thank you both for being here. Hi, nice to meet you.
Donald.
Hi, Janita Castro, nice to see you. Thanks for having us.
Hi, how are you?
Thank you.
How you doing?
Nice to see you.
They're so pretty.
I love the rooms.
Yeah, and the transparency is so fun.
I love it. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I want to thank everybody for being here. And we will be joined by some folks as we are in process. We expect to have a 2 o'clock vote, so we're going to try to move with some rapidity. As we near the end of Black History Month, I'm pleased to join you for today's forum on Confederate monuments and the lasting legacies of the American Civil War. I want to thank my chairman, Chairman Grijalva, for his tireless leadership and for convening this panel. I also want to thank our distinguished panelists for sharing your time and expertise. Today's discussion is deeply personal for me, both as a proud native Richmonder and as a student of political history. Across the country, we are engaged in an ongoing conversation about the American experience during the Civil War and the ways in which we choose to reflect upon and represent that shared past, both good and bad. I believe our nation's monuments and statues have the ability to be unifying symbols of the struggles, sacrifices, and contributions made by all Americans and a source of shared patriotic pride. Unfortunately, I have seen and felt firsthand the pain that Confederate monuments can cause for my community and for communities across the United States. Too many Confederate memorials aim to rewrite or glorify the reputation of Confederate leaders and in turn ignore or minimize the nation's vile history of slavery and racism. As we witnessed during the horrifying and devastating Unite the Rally in Charlottesville, that's Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, attempts by local communities to historically contextualize these statues or to remove them completely is often met with fierce and sometimes deadly backlash. It is for these reasons and so many more that I led a letter with my colleague, Congresswoman Wexton of Northern Virginia, calling for the removal and replacement of the Robert E. Lee statue in the U.S. Capitol crypt. I also introduced legislation last Congress which would conduct a full inventory of Confederate commemorative works on our nation's public lands to help enable their suitability as resources for the interpretation of the American Civil War. These actions are positive steps forward in creating a more inclusive American story, but more still needs to be done. That's why I'm pleased to see my own Virginia General Assembly recently passed in the House of Delegates and Senate the ability to allow cities and counties to remove, relocate, contextualize, cover, or alter monuments in public spaces. I encourage the governor to sign this legislation into law once it reaches his desk. As Americans, we have a responsibility to not only learn from, but also confront our history. We must strive for a more complete telling of history by raising up the voices, stories, and memories of people of color. And at the same time, we must consider what monuments we can build to acknowledge the horrors of slavery and to honor those who dedicated their lives to fighting for equality. Please excuse me. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to yield to my colleague from New Mexico, Congresswoman Holland.
Thank you so much. And thank you both for being here, taking the time to be here, and for sharing the stories that you will share and your insights with this committee. I want you to know that your voices are very, very important to us, and they will be part of this record, and so thank you for being here. America's public lands and waters belong to all Americans, and this committee is committed to ensuring these protected places are inclusive and representative of the diversity of the American experience, especially at a time when this president and this administration has repeatedly deprioritized or reversed efforts to increase the rights and representation of all people. Today, we want to hear from you about how we can elevate your voices and ensure that our public lands represent and can be enjoyed by all Americans and are not symbols of hatred and intolerance, which should be something of the past. We know it can be validating and dignifying for the National Park Service to tell stories about underrepresented communities. Even stories of historical mistreatment can serve to educate our fellow Americans and lead to real change. But when our parks and monuments glorify stories of intolerance, hatred, or abuse, it gives those views validation. I know how I feel about these sorts of monuments as a Native American, and I also know how much pride it gives us when we have opportunities to share our real history with the country. And I just want to bring attention for a moment to the statue of Popeye that's in the Visitor Center right now. Popeye was a Pueblo leader whose voice was extremely important back in the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. And that statue was carved by a Native American artist, a Pueblo artist in New Mexico. And everything on that is symbolic about the struggle and the survival and the perseverance of Native Americans in my state of New Mexico. So I realize how we can give voice to those underrepresented communities in this country. And so today, your voice is serving as a reminder for all of us that we can always strive to do better. And so I really, really appreciate you both being here, and I yield, Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Holland. And now I'll introduce our guests. First is, now I need you all to correct me if I'm mispronouncing your name, because I have a hard last name, so I get it, all right? But Janita Castro. She is the outdoor Afro leader in Charlotte, North Carolina. In 2016, she joined the leadership team in a communications role. She was also chosen to represent outdoor Afro on an 8-day rafting trip in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Must have been cold. One of the most remote places on the planet, her outdoor passions include summit hiking, climbing, and water sports. And we also have with us Elsa Mengistu. She is currently the operations coordinator at 0 Hour, a grassroots youth climate organization. She attends Howard University and is a native of North Carolina by passage through the cradle of humanity, Ethiopia. She has advocated for changes on various issues, including electoral politics, racial justice, LGBTQ+ equality, and women's rights through local organizations and school clubs. We welcome you both. We suggest that you at least start off with a 5-minute statement, and we'll see if there are questions afterwards. And again, our deepest thanks for you being here. We'll yield to you, Ms. Castro.
Do I need to press this button?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. I'm here as a representative of Outdoor Afro on behalf of CEO and founder Rue Mapp, our 90 volunteer leaders across the country, as well as our 40,000 community members across the country. Monuments are neither just about heritage or just about hate. They are values made visible. That's why we build memorials to some parts of history and ignore others. They embody the ideas that we choose to lift up. And the legacy of slavery is defined as a pervasive social structure rooted in the racist ideology used to justify and support slavery, and research suggests that it remains involved in the maintenance of contemporary racial inequality in the United States. This is not just about history, it is about the present. These monuments romanticize and idealize the Civil War. Heather O'Connell, in her paper, Monuments Outlive History, Confederate Monuments, the Legacy of Slavery and Black-White Inequality, suggests that Confederate monuments with particular messages, namely ones that support the lost cause narrative of heroism, patriotism, and the defense of states' rights and monuments, with inscriptions that portray Confederates as heroes and motivations for the war as pure and just, drive connection to contemporary racial inequality that still holds true today. So what can we do about this? We can start by telling the truth and teaching truth in classrooms and in history books. We can tell the truth in our national parks. We can start by telling the truth even on the National Park Service website, which on one page says, yes, there are Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, and the other obvious heroes of the Civil War. That is not a true statement, and we know that now. And we hope that Outdoor Afro is a powerful voice in making these changes. So I'm going to tell you a story. One of our leaders in San Francisco, Zoe Polk, in 2016. I just got word that a placard detailing the civil rights history of one of my favorite parks, Golden Gate National Recreation Area, operated by the United States National Park Service, has been put up. I've been leading hikes on this trail since I started as an Outdoor Afro leader in 2013 and narrated the Black history as a way to connect over 100 Black folks to this beautiful place on San Francisco's coast. I use the absence of the park's recognition of John Harris's story as a lesson in making sure that we retell our stories to each other, regardless of official recognition. Before every hike, I would introduce myself to the visitor center staff and let them know about the hike we were doing and the importance of it, and why our story needs to be included on the trail markers. I encourage participants to do the same, so I'd like to think that years of doing this catalyzed this installation and the story of John Harris to be told in one of our national parks. As we continue to honor Confederate leaders and deny their crimes, we signal that the United States has not fully come to terms with its collective responsibility for the dual sins of slavery and Jim Crow. Tiara Chapman, Outdoor Afro leader in Texas, says, I don't feel welcome or safe in spaces where I see the Confederate flag. It's a symbol of terrorism from a terrorist organization. From Melinda Spooner, Outdoor Afro leader in Indiana. For me, these monuments serve as a giant keep-away sign, especially the Confederate flag. But any location with a prominent Confederate hero, statue, or flag flying signals a few things to me. One, at some point in recent history, this place was, at best, part of an active resistance to acknowledging the humanity of Black people. At worst, there's a likelihood that they enacted an all-out campaign in terror among Black people. Two, it's still standing, so there's a strong likelihood of folks still here that were part of whatever bad things were enacted upon Black people, or at the very least were okay watching their friends and neighbors do terrible things. Therefore, there's a strong likelihood that my family and I won't be safe here, physically or psychologically. That kind of stress and potential danger just isn't worth experiencing or putting my family through if I can help it. Many of our leaders and constituents don't go to Stone Mountain in Georgia. Tashana Taylor, Outdoor Afro leader in Miami, was very disturbed when she saw the Confederate flag flying at Stone Mountain. She doesn't expect anyone to actually remove the monument carved in stone, but the Confederate flag has no place flying next to an American flag, much less at a place where people recreate. So what are the solutions that we see here? We can look at other countries as models. There are no monuments to Hitler in Germany. Last year, faculty and students at the University of Ghana successfully removed a Mahatma Gandhi statue for his racist views of Africans, and protesters in Poland overturned a statue of Solidarity-era priest Monsignor Henryk Jakowski because of allegations that he sexually abused minors. Maybe context needs to be added to provide more actual historical references. Maybe they all need to be removed and destroyed. Maybe they need to be relocated to cemeteries where many of them were originally placed. What Outdoor Afro believes is that they have no place in our national parks or our state parks where people go to recreate and find joy and healing. But more importantly, we should be taking the time to talk about new monuments to people who were on the right side of history during that time. People like Powhatan Beatty, Andrew Caillou, Robert Smalls, William Carney, and James Daniel Gardner. Finally, I want to share some words from Danny Daniel, Outdoor Afro leader in Texas. Our young people need to know of and about our past, but they don't need to be reminded by statues and monuments that represent and celebrate a group that would have done anything to divide this great nation that was still being formed in its infancy stage when compared to other countries. I say no, and not on our watch. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Ms. Mengistu. It should be red when you push it.
Hello? Okay. Thank you for having me. My name is Elsa Mengistu. I'm an immigrant, a climate justice organizer, and a student. While I am all of these things, today I sit here in front of you to speak about being a Black woman from North Carolina. I moved to the United States with my family from Ethiopia around the age of 2 and settled in a rural part of North Carolina. Part of my childhood, I went to a diverse elementary school where my peers looked like me and kids came from all over. It was great until it wasn't. Fast forward to 3rd grade, and my parents decided to move my family to the country part of North Carolina, a little place called Davidson County. Here, I was the only other Black girl in our grade until middle school, where I met no more than 5 other girls in the entirety of those 3 years. Davidson County is where I learned that racists and racism exists in every part of life, and a deep and hurtful part of that is realizing that you can never escape racism, not in a public school and not in a public setting. Davidson County, to paint a picture for you, is the epitome of heritage, not hate. I grew up saying that phrase before I even knew what it meant. That's what happens when the school you go to has Confederate flags hanging from trucks, are sewn onto people's belts, and are praised day in and day out. I didn't know, at least not until middle school, when I began to research social issues and learn about histories and narratives left out outside of the classroom. What I learned didn't matter as much compared to what learning did for me as a student and a person. By reading about people in the margins of history, I found myself as well. It was here when I acquired the loud and angry Black girl label, when I began to openly and thoroughly question the things my classmates said, the things my teachers taught us, and the culture that surrounds us. This is when I got a personal glimpse of what heritage, not hate, truly meant. Is this heritage just the abuse and ridicule of Black bodies? What is heritage, and how much of it should be preserved? Is heritage denouncing your country? Is heritage just a history you want to preserve? What is that history, and what does that do for us? What I learned through my years in this school system is that heritage can be all of the above and more. But if it is, then it is heritage and hate. A Confederate heritage rooted in the destruction of Black bodies is hate. Heritage, not hate, is no longer applicable. Why would my classmates champion a past world where people that looked like me were enslaved, lynched, and broken up? Why? Why is that our heritage? Was it for heritage when the MAGA boys in my class left racist papers and Confederate flags and white supremacist memes on my desk after not standing for the Pledge of Allegiance? Is it heritage to not print out the flag of a seceded nation that went to war to maintain the right to own and commodify Black bodies? Was it heritage to not hate when students and teachers lost their collective minds when I started a multicultural youth club? All I wanted to do was empower and connect students of color in an overly white space. What I got in return were in-school fights, pastors coming to school concerned about the division I was creating, and being overly policed by adult figures. Is this the heritage we want to preserve? Is this the not hate we hear about? Each of those experiences, on top of many, many more, have exposed to me that this debate about anything Confederate-related is about power. Power is the basis for everything, and this is no exception. If in my own public school I wasn't able to express the extent of my Blackness and identity, where else can I? A space I pay for, we all pay for, a space open to any and every student. If my holding space for other students of color yielded such blowback, what does that mean for students in spaces where they don't have the same support from community and faculty that I did? If every time I or somebody else challenged a twisted narrative was bamboozled by people shouting heritage, not hate, who were in fact spreading hatred and bigotry, I can only come to one conclusion, This specific heritage is hate, and hate has no space to be in our public arenas. Spaces for the public are to be reflective of the complex, ever-changing, and diverse society we live in. The only reason Confederate monuments exist is to do what people may not be able to do themselves, to instill fear and to remind us what our place in this world is. Going to a public school where Confederate symbols are normal, I can promise you that these symbols have influenced generations and cultures in ways we don't want to imagine. Going to school and living in a space like this meant chipping away at my identity, my sanity, my expression, my heart, and meant filing myself down to fit into a box for safety day in and day out. I am loud, I am expressive, I am a visionary, and it feels as if a culture of heritage, no hate, which I grew up in, tried to suck all of that and more out of me. Confederate statues must go. Leaving Confederate statues in places where we can remove them and in spaces that are for families and for the general public is a disservice and an injustice to the millions of kids like me who just want to grow up freely, to grow up boldly in our authenticity and in our blackness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we thank both of you all for those statements. Let me pose a question to each of you. And the question would be this: as you probably know, there's a lot of controversy surrounding Confederate memorials and whether they should be able to be removed or left alone and that sort of thing. In each of your opinions, is the problem too many Confederate memorials and not enough to other folks like Native Americans and African Americans, or is it both? So let me pose that to you. Too many Confederate monuments, not enough monuments to other folks, or the problem's both, that we don't have enough of either, or too much of one and not enough of either, of the other?
Are you saying, are there too much, one, like Confederate statues, and two, not enough of like statues representation?
I'm asking, is that a problem in your view?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
I'm asking, is that a problem in your view, that there are too many Confederate monuments and not enough monuments to?
I think that is a problem. The problem isn't that we have too many Confederate statues, it's that we have them at all, and they're shown off proudly. Representation without acknowledging how we got to this representation doesn't do anything. One statue that represents my history is not equivalent to one statue that destroyed my history.
I would agree with that. I think that these monuments are also in very public spaces where people are supposed to be free and find kind of joy in recreation. So there are definitely, there's an inequality in the balance of monuments, because there was a time where a lot of the history that we want to put forward is hidden and buried. And we find, our Outdoor Afro leaders find this very often, is that when we take people out to parks or to public spaces, is that we try to find a African-American connection to the space that we're in. And our leaders are doing research, and deep research in libraries and looking at old texts to find the history that has been buried and put away. So there are lots of stories that can be told, and we're not doing a good job telling them in these public spaces.
What would it take to do a better job?
Well, it takes resources, right? It takes people who are dedicated to doing this work. If we look at the people who are even writing the markers in national parks, who's writing them? What's their background? What's their history? What do they know about? Are they knowledgeable in all aspects of different histories and cultures in order to write those things? I think we always need to look at who's sitting in the room and who is in charge of writing these texts to make sure that there are diverse voices and diverse perspectives in that room. So that's would be one place to start. The second place is to look at removing these monuments from these spaces that are supposed to be spaces of joy and healing, because none of these monuments give that feeling, and they also don't tell the truth. And we need to start telling the truth, and we need to even look at our own government websites for truth-telling.
There's a old saying that I'm sure both of you have heard before that says that something to the effect of that those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it. How should we treat Confederate history? How do we remember it so that we don't repeat it?
I think acknowledgement, one, we live in a country where we have not acknowledged our past, therefore we cannot heal from it. We have states all across the southern U.S. where they can teach their own version of history. If I buy a history book in Texas, it won't tell me African slaves came here, it'll tell me Africans migrated here forcefully. That's a narrative that's completely changed. If we want to remove Confederate statues in the first place, we have to acknowledge the history that comes behind that. We have to accurately teach the history that comes from that. And I haven't seen that in my high schools. I go to a high school that is named after Confederate leaders. And so we live in a reality where we don't even acknowledge the burden and the trauma and the shame that comes from this history, let alone healing from it. And so until we do that, and until we fix our education systems where we're accurately teaching these narratives that are missing, we can't get anywhere.
I'm going to echo everything that Elsa said, and to add to that is that what happened during the Civil War is obviously part of this country's history, and the bigger issue is that there's no context around these placards and monuments about what really happened or how you tell the other side of that very romanticized story. And there are people, and lots of people that are extremely knowledgeable and do this work for a living that can add that context and put these monuments into context and put them where they belong, which is not in public spaces.
I lost my question just that quick, but I thank both of you all for your input thus far. You know, getting to be 58 years old is a problem. Well, I can't remember my question. I apologize to you. I should have written it down. I want to thank both of you all for being here. If you all have any final comments you wish to make, this would be the appropriate time.
I will add that there's a lot of discussion around national parks and visitation to national parks continuing to decline over the years. We do know that if we want our national parks to thrive, that they need to be opening and welcoming to people from all backgrounds and all communities. And from a very base level of understanding and a base level of the joy and beauty that's in national parks, we need to look at what we're putting forth in national parks as symbols of love and symbols that are actually symbols of hate. If we want people to feel comfortable to go to them in the future, we want to keep our national parks thriving for the next 100 years.
I'm a climate justice organizer, and that means I want people to have access to clean air, clean water, and green spaces. And Black and brown communities don't have access to green spaces in the same way white communities do. And when we have these spaces that exist, but they hold harmful and hurtful memories, that's already placing a burden on an already limited population that doesn't have access to these spaces. And so I want people and kids that look like me to be able to run around in fields and just to enjoy national parks without having to think about the history that comes from that. I think access to nature, despite the construction that we live in, it's a human right. We are humans, we are of this earth. And so I want to see people that look like me be comfortable and thriving in spaces that are outside. And that begins with removal of Confederate statues and symbols from those spaces.
All right. Well, we thank you both for lending your time to us today, and we look forward to working with you in the future as we address this very thorny problem of how do we remember history and whose history gets remembered. Thank you.